Hello. The focus of this video is American foreign and defense policy, which is covered in chapter 14 in your book. So please make sure you read the assigned pages. But I want to talk just a little bit about these topics. American foreign policy refers to the United States' relationship with other countries, and then defense policy is a reference to how we defend ourselves militarily in terms of defending against attacks from foreign powers, or how we get involved in military situations in other countries. So in terms of American foreign policy, just kind of a brief history that's also discussed in Chapter 14. The United States, when we first were established as an independent nation in the 1770s, 1780s, we were largely isolationist, which meant that we did not engage very much with other countries. There was a feeling at that time that we needed to build ourselves up internally, and of course in 1776 or 1780 or 1790, the United States was still a relatively small nation. We did not have a large military. We were certainly not a major world power. So we had a very small foreign policy at that time. Now, the cabinet department that handles foreign policy is the State Department. The U.S. State Department is responsible for implementing our foreign policy. The president appoints the Secretary of State, who is in charge of the State Department, and that person then has to be confirmed by the Senate. But they are largely in charge of American foreign policy during their time in that position. The Secretary of State is considered to be the most important member of the president's cabinet. Previous secretaries of state have included Colin Powell, who was a general a number of years ago. There was also Hillary Clinton, who, of course, later on ran for president, but she was President Obama's first Secretary of State. And a number of other famous figures from history. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, and several other very famous people. When we talk about the U.S. Secretary of State, we're not talking about the person who's in charge of driver's licenses and voting in Michigan. That's a completely separate office, even though they have the same name. So the U.S. Secretary of State, the U.S. State Department, is responsible for U.S. foreign policy. It's also where people can get their passport if they're an American citizen. So our foreign policy was largely isolationist until the 20th century, the 1940s. And the idea was that we didn't engage in world affairs very much. We kept to ourselves. We were involved in several wars in our history in the 19th and into the 20th century. But it was really World War II when the United States finally really became engaged in world affairs, and we've stayed engaged ever since. So we gave up the idea of isolationism. And by the middle of the 20th century, the United States had become the wealthiest nation in the world, and we also had developed the largest military in the world. And it just wasn't really a viable idea to go back to isolationism. So in the aftermath of World War II, which the United States was very much involved in defeating the Germany, Japan, and Italy, who were our main opponents in those wars. All of them now are allies of the United States, but they were our enemies during the war. After the war ended, the United States was instrumental in establishing the United Nations, which is still around today. It's headquartered in New York City, and it's an international body that is made up of many nations in the world, not every country in the world, but almost all of them, and they engage with each other on matters. So the idea is to hopefully avoid another world war, and so far we have not had another world war since the end of World War II in 1945. Certainly there have been many other wars, skirmishes, battles, all kinds of things. Terrorism and the rest, but we have not had another world war, and the United Nations has been a key part of that. In terms of American foreign policy since World War II, from 1945 until 1990, about that time period, the United States was involved in what was called the Cold War. That is when we were basically engaged against the Soviet Union, which eventually dissolved and became Russia and several other countries. But the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, was a communist country. They had been our ally in World War II, but when the war ended, we had a major falling out over what would happen in Europe at the end of the war. and so the Soviet Union really became a dominant force in Eastern Europe, and the United States had a strong influence in the western part of Europe. And during those 45 years or so that we were kind of in the Cold War, we never actually went to direct war with the Soviets. That's why it's called a Cold War, not a hot war. We never actually fought each other on the battlefield. But certainly we had, during that time, we had nuclear weapons aimed at each other. Nuclear technology was developed at the end of World War II. And in fact, the United States used atomic bombs to end World War II. And so the Soviets eventually also developed their own nuclear weapons, and so we had nuclear arms aimed at each other for that time period. There were a number of treaties during the Cold War to reduce the tensions. We almost went to war with the Soviets in 1962, which would have been catastrophic because it would have been a nuclear war, and none of us right now would likely even be here if that had happened. So. But the Cold War did finally end in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Soviet Union essentially kind of went bankrupt. They just couldn't afford to maintain the military presence that they had kept up for those years. The United States was in a better position, and so and of course we were allied with other countries. It wasn't just the United States doing this alone. We worked with a lot of Western European countries, NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and a number of, and the United Nations even. But the Soviet Union did collapse. And so in the years since the end of the Cold War, 1990 to now, the last 30-some years, there's been a focus on terrorism. We know what happened on 9/11, 2001, with the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. So in the years since then, the United States has been involved in wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and some other places that are tied to the war involving terrorism. There's a lot of controversy about whether we need to be involved in those places, and President Biden has focused on withdrawing the United States from Afghanistan, where we've been for 20 years. In terms of other issues of foreign policy, in the Cold War, the United States developed, in addition to having the State Department to handle foreign policy, there was the Defense Department was created out of the old Department of War, and the Defense Department is at the Pentagon in Washington to help presidents with defense policy, since we do have nuclear weapons, and it's such an important part of our military strategy to deal with that. And the United States military has been very active in world affairs in other countries in the years since the end of the World War II. The National Security Council, which is discussed in Chapter 14, is a body that was created in the White House to advise the president on foreign and defense policy. And the person who holds that position of National Security Advisor is a very important aid to the president in devising foreign policy. So make sure you read through that information in the book. There's a lot of discussion of other issues that have come up in the course of the last few years involving Russia, involving China, certainly the issues that have come up in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and other parts of the Middle East, Yemen, Syria, and so forth, the rise of ISIS and in parts of the Middle East. And foreign policy is always changing; it's always evolving. Former President Trump was focused on kind of isolating in a lot of ways the America First idea, but President Biden has focused on getting more engaged in the world and working with our allies. And so presidents do sometimes have different foreign policies. The Trump policy was dramatically different from either the policies of other Republicans or Democrats. And the foreign policy that the President Biden is pursuing is more kind of in keeping with how presidents have operated in over the years. So if you have any questions about foreign policy, please email me. One other thing to mention is the authors of your book refer to the War Powers Act and the fact that Congress is supposed to be the institution that declares war. That's in the Constitution, and the War Powers Act was a way of trying to reassert Congress's role in war powers. Make sure you read that, because over the years, presidents have sent troops into battle many times without getting a declaration of war, and that's a major issue in our history. So, all right, if you have any questions, let me know.